Okay, so what I want to talk about now is um, just some basic concepts, kind of an overview of race and ethnicity, some general terminology that you're going to need as we kind of move through the rest of the semester. So let's start with race. When when we talk about race, what we mean is a socially defined group of people who are generally considered to be physically distinct in some way from others and who are regarded by themselves or others as a distinct group. There are two components to race. The first is a social component, that's the group identity. Um, the second is, and that it contains, the valuations, the identity component itself, um, some of the history, some of the social features of that particular group, where it stands in the society, things of that nature. The second component of race is the physical component, and by this we mean the markers that we use to engage in racial classification or racial categorization. I'm going to talk about race as a social construct in just a few minutes, but I want to also sort of lay out what we mean by ethnicity. Ethnicity is, like race, also a social construct, which I'll get to in just a moment. But when we talk about ethnicity, we're talking about a group of people who are generally regarded by themselves or others as a distinct group, but the recognition is going to be based on social and cultural characteristics, such as nationality, language, religion, region of origin, right? That kind of thing. So both terms get used, but it's very important to remember that they're not interchangeable. Race and ethnicity um, often overlap, but they are not the same. They are not the same thing. So let me talk about what we mean when we describe both of these things as social constructs, because both race and ethnicity are socially constructed. A social construct is just a jointly constructed or shared understanding of the world. Um, so something like symbols are socially constructed. So when I wave, um, the person to whom I'm waving or the people to whom I'm waving take from that experience the same intent or the same meaning as I had in mind when I was communicating it. It's because we jointly construct a shared understanding of what this means, right? And if we're all coming together at the beginning of the class, this can mean hello. If we're all leaving at the end of class, this exact same gesture can mean goodbye, right? Because we're constructing an understanding of it. This doesn't have any inherent meaning, right? This is just a hand moving at the end of an extended and upraised arm. So, nothing more, nothing less. But what it means, um, both to the person using it and to the receivers of that experience, that part is the social construct, right? So when we talk about race and ethnicity, there is no there is no inherently objective thing called race. Race is an understanding that we base on a wide variety of things. In the United States, specifically, it significantly involves things like skin color. It involves other physical traits that we use to kind of put people into various categories. But the existence of those categories, the dividing line that separates one from the other, the consequences of being in one group or another, none of those things are natural. All of those things kind of flow from human activities. So that's what we mean when we say that race is socially constructed. Genes and adaptation play a role in the markers of race, and I'll talk about that in a moment. But from a scientific standpoint, race is not a biologically valid concept. For something to be scientifically valid, it has to be falsifiable. This is a concept that means that if something is false, we can determine that through observation or measurement or testing. The problem is that racial classifications lack falsifiability. Certainly, there are some people in sort of recognized racial categories that we would all agree that person is black, that person is Asian, that person is white. But especially as we get close to the borders, right, the boundaries of those racial classifications, it becomes a little less clear, right? There's a lot less consensus, and it becomes contestable. Well, something that's objectively measurably true or not is not going to be contestable, right? A fact is a thing that is just true. That's what makes it a fact. It's not an opinion. Opinions can't be falsified because there's no grounds for falsifying them. I like coffee. Coffee is awesome, right? Coffee is awesome is an opinion. It's not right or wrong. You can't disprove that coffee is awesome. You know, coffee is made up of the following chemical elements. You could absolutely falsify that because chemical elements are chemical elements, and we can test for those things. So when we talk about race as a social construct, that's what we're getting at. Now, that doesn't make it any less real, right? This still can mean hello and goodbye, even though it's completely arbitrary. There's nothing in this that means hello and goodbye except that we say it does. Um, so we can create a racial category as a society, right? We can create a racial category. We can put people in that category. Even if they don't want to be classified that way, we can certainly do that if we have the power to do it. And then we can attach consequences to being in those categories. But those categories don't come from nature. They come from us as a collection, as a group, as a society with a history, with a set of material conditions and things like that. So so the reason why, or the problem with a biological underpinning for race, or trying to create a biological underpinning for race, as opposed to the features we use for racial categorization. Again, I want to be clear, those things are biological. But race itself is not. There's not a black gene. There's not a white gene. Um, the criteria that we use to put people into racial categories, um, those criteria or those characteristics are separately heritable, right? There is a gene that controls the amount of melanin in a person's skin cells, right? It produces darker or lighter color skin cells. Um, there is also a gene or a set of genes that control the color and texture of a person's hair. But you can inherit dark skin and straight hair. You can inherit curly or kinky hair and light skin, right? They're separately heritable. There isn't a black gene. There isn't a white gene. And so um, we can't point to a particular gene or a precise combination of genes that allow us to say this person is a particular race and this other person is a different race. So to the degree to which race and ethnicity are real, it's because we make them real in our response to them. There's a concept that comes out of social psychology and symbolic interaction, early Chicago school back in the 1920s. This guy named W.I. Thomas, who was doing studies of immigration from people coming into Chicago from other parts of the world. And he was studying Polish communities, and he's really interested in the way in which the cultural resources that a person coming to a new place, the cultural resources they brought with them would sort of play out and shape the lives and experiences of these people in a new environment. And he made an observation that we've come to call the Thomas theorem. We also call it definition of the situation. He wrote back in 1927, he wrote, if men define situations as real, they are real in their consequences. And you can kind of update the language to be a little less gendered. And you could say, if people define situations as real, they are real in their consequences. I want to be clear, this is not the same as saying that a person's perception is reality. Reality is reality. But a person's perceptions of reality will guide and direct and shape their behavior, irrespective of what reality actually is. If I think someone is a threat to me, I may cross the street. I may put my hands in my coat pockets to suggest that I may have a weapon, right? Some keys or a knife or a gun or something to defend myself, right? So my perception of a threat leads me to engage in particular behaviors, irrespective of whether this person I see across the street from me is in fact a threat, right? So perceptions shape our behavior. And so take that concept of definition of the situation and just, again, apply it to this notion of a social construct. If enough of us say that race is a real thing and we can make it consequential by putting people into these racial categories or these ethnic categories and then attaching consequences to those locations, right, to being in one category or another, then it becomes real in its consequences. The differences, just to echo what you've read or you will read in the short piece by Harris, the anthropologist Harris, the differences are responses to environmental conditions, right? So um, ultraviolet radiation, which comes primarily from exposure to the sun, creates a risk of developing various types of cancers. Um, so um, people living in regions of the world where there's a significant amount of exposure to ultraviolet radiation, over time, darker skin color is selected for because it's resistant to UVR. Um, it's beneficial, right? Dark skin in equatorial regions or certain regions of the Arctic or the Antarctic, because they experience long periods of exposure to the sun, lead to darker skin being selected for over time, right? Just kind of Darwinian evolution. As populations moved north and south of the equatorial regions of the planet, the darker skin that they had inherited started to come with a cost, because it turns out that ultraviolet radiation is necessary for the production of vitamin D. And so if you didn't get enough exposure to the sun, to UVR specifically, then you would develop deficiencies in vitamin D, and you would also not be selected for in the same way that somebody dying of cancer would not be selected for in terms of passing on their genetic material. So in those northern and southern latitudes away from the equator, people over time developed lighter color skin, right? The lower levels of melanin in skin cells was selected for because it was environmentally and evolutionarily advantageous. So skin color literally is just skin deep. It has no consequences or implications beyond that for things like intelligence or aptitude or motivation or a work ethic. But we'll talk about the way that those things get woven into our constructions of race. But race itself, right? The skin color or hair texture or the shape and color of a person's eyes, those are just physiological responses to environmental conditions over multiple generations, right? And again, a process of natural selection. So skin color differences are real. Eye shape and color differences are real. Hair color and texture differences are real, right? All of those things are real, but race is not. We just make it real. Ethnicity is not. We just make it real. And so we want to look at that process of categorization and try to think about the way in which sort of pre-existing dispositions among human beings lead us to do this, right? To organize and differentiate and categorize and things like that. And I'll talk about that in a moment. And then we also want to look at the historical and the political and the economic circumstances in which racial categories and ethnic categories come into existence and the purpose they serve, right? We create these things at various points in human history because they serve some purpose. And even after the purpose itself has kind of been rendered obsolete, the categories themselves may linger on. I mean, you can see a really silly everyday example of this right now in the way that we talk about dialing a phone number. Nobody dials anything anymore, right? We still have that language, that linguistic artifact from a time when there were rotary dial phones. But these days, most people don't even have a keypad. They just touch a smartphone screen, and that actually dials the number for them. And again, it's not an act of dialing; it's an act of touching. But we don't say, you're going to touch a phone call or touch a phone number. You're going to say, I'm going to dial a phone number. So you can see the way in which something that we create might persist long past its literal application, right? It becomes kind of, again, like I said, a kind of a linguistic or social or cultural artifact of some previous time. And one of the things we'll see is that racial categorization served a particular purpose when it emerges in the British American colonies back in the 1600s. Um, that purpose is arguably, long since past. But the categories remain, and the consequences of how we treated people who were assigned to those categories. This is the other thing that history is really, really important in helping us out with, is to look at where those categories came from, what purpose did they serve, why did we create them that way, and then, of course, because we create those differences and we put people into the different categories accordingly, the differential treatment of one racial or ethnic group over time can have kind of a long-standing impact on their children and their children's children and their grandchildren, great-grandchildren, et cetera, et cetera. So we want to kind of look at that. But I want to say really quickly a couple of quick things about, and this is maybe a reflection of my background in social psychology, but there is a tendency among humans, and it's certainly encouraged and supported and sustained through a set of cultural practices that build on that. But there's a tendency for us to categorize, right? I don't know if you've ever heard of the term apophenia, but apophenia is a tendency. It's a cognitive tendency to perceive patterns in otherwise meaningless or random information or data. So when you look at the moon and you see a face, there isn't a face in the moon. It's craters. It's ancient lava beds. It's sun and shadow, right, and reflected light. But when we look at the moon, you can kind of see a face there if you're kind of tending to look for it. We can anthropomorphize a lot of inanimate objects, right? You take the front end of an automobile, and you see the grill and you see the two headlights, and it's a car, but you can kind of also see like two eyes and a mouth. That's how Disney has kind of been able to build, or Pixar, I should say, has been able to build the Cars franchise and in the animated film series that they produce all the time. Um, we do that all the time. You might look at an electrical outlet in the wall, and you see the two slots for the prongs, and then the hole for the ground. But you might also see two eyes and a mouth. And if we saw a person walking down the hall at Harper whose head looked like an outlet, we'd freak out. But we can kind of see a face there because, again, that's one of the things that we do. We take data, or we take information, and we resolve it into things that are meaningful. That tendency is called apophenia, and specifically when we see faces, that's called pareidolia. So these, and again, you're not going to get tested on any of that, but it's just kind of interesting to know where that tendency comes from. But the strong inference seems to be that we don't like randomness. We don't like unpredictability. As a species, we need the world to exist as a series of meaningful, discrete chunks that we can kind of make sense of and categorize and organize. And so, people like Zerubbabel, who's kind of well-known social psychologist, talks about islands of meaning, the way that we use cultural resources to kind of lump some things together, like all humans are distinct from other animals, and then some animals are distinct from other animals. So we kind of lump things together. But then we also split things apart, right? We might say, humans with this particular skin color or humans from this particular geographic place of origin are different from these other humans who come from a different geographical place of origin or have a different set of physical characteristics. Um, so that process that Zerubbabel calls lumping and splitting is kind of an extension of this tendency that we have to organize things into categories. We see similarities, we see differences where it is necessary and beneficial for us to do that, and sometimes we even create them, and those creations then have a kind of they kind of have a life. They become phenomena that we can observe, we can describe, we can explain and evaluate, as I mentioned in the last lecture. But the categories, these racial categories that we use and these ethnic categories that we use, are sort of historically and culturally contingent, right? That when we look at, for example, and we'll talk about the history of this a lot over the coming weeks as the semester unfolds, but when we look at where race originates, our understanding of race, and I say our, I mean the United States, right? 21st century America. Our understanding of race comes from um, an effort to create and then sustain a particular form of slavery that was being practiced called chattel slavery. So there was bonded labor. I don't want to get too deep into the weeds because we'll unpack this later. But bonded labor, which just means that your labor belongs to someone else for some period of time. Bonded labor in the British American colonies back in the 1500s and early 1600s was what we call indentured servitude. So your labor didn't belong to you. You worked for someone else because they held the bond. They had your labor was kind of the debt that you owed them. When your debt was paid, you were free, right? So after 1619, when Africans begin to arrive in the British American colonies and they are indentured servants, like the white indentured servants who are already here, um, people aren't stupid. They can look at somebody from Africa and go, wow, that guy's dark skinned. And they can look at somebody from, the south of England and go, oh my God, that guy's got very white skin. So it's not that they didn't see differences, but the differences didn't mean then what they do mean today, or what they would mean, say, for example, by the late 1700s, early 1800s. So the thing that mattered was, are you free or is your labor bonded? Well, by the time we get into the 1700s, being bonded was synonymous in many respects with being black. And that process took about 100 years to happen, and you can kind of look at history and see how it incrementally kind of unfolds. But we created these racial categories so that we could very easily enslave and buy and sell a particular class of people because it was economically advantageous to have that kind of bonded labor, to have slaves. So the categories are historically, they have a history. They have a set of values and ideas that are kind of built in and around them. The consequences of the existence of the categories, the people in the categories, the productions and the consequences of the categories can then turn around and simultaneously shape the processes that created the categories in the first place. And I'll talk about that in a moment. It's a concept called racial formation. But what happens is we take these social constructs and we put them through a process of what we call essentialism or essentialization. And essentialism just means that it's a belief, right? More often than not, if you see a word that ends with ISM, that means a belief, right? So essentialism is a belief that meaningful phenomenon, like race, for example, exist independent of human judgment, or sex, or gender, or sexuality. These things describe, in some ways, things that people do or characteristics that people possess, but they are oversimplifications. They're approximations. They're models, right? They're social constructs. The reality is that skin color varies significantly. You could take everybody, take a sample, because there's over 7 billion people in the world, but take a sample of people around the world. Say you get 1,000 people and you line them up shoulder to shoulder. You've selected them from all around the world, right? So no one particular place. Line them up shoulder to shoulder based on how dark a person's skin is, all the way over to how light a person's skin is. And you look up and down that line of people, you're going to see variation in skin color. Some people are going to be darker skinned than other people. But where we draw the line, right? Where does black stop and brown begin? Where does brown end and white begin? Same thing, you could do it with height, right? You could line people up from the shortest person to the tallest person. And what you'd see is a variation in, the total distance between the top of a person's head and the bottom of their feet. But where does tall start? Where does short end? Does anyone care, right? Maybe we put the line right in the middle. Okay, that seems like a reasonable proposition. But there's nothing natural. There's nothing in nature that says the people on one side of this line are tall and the people on the other side of this line are short. Tall and short are just understandings that we've created to impose on this group of people who have some variability in the distance between the bottom of their feet and the top of their heads, right? So there's nothing in nature that is tall, right? Tall is just a judgment. Now, it could seem totally innocuous being short, tall, who cares? What if everybody who is tall got an extra, 500 calories of food a day? Suddenly being on the other side of that line, especially for people who are really close to the center, suddenly being on the other side of that line would be really, really consequential. And they might want to fight about where we draw that line. So what we do when we essentialize something is that we take something that's socially constructed and we sort of assume that it's a reflection of underlying natural phenomenon like biology or genetics or something like that. But race is not. Race is not a genetic phenomenon. It's a construct. Ethnicity is not a genetic phenomenon. It's a construct. And so it's important that you guys are comfortable with that concept. So I mentioned racial formation, and we're going to talk about this a little bit more in depth over the course of the semester. In many ways, a lot of what we're going to do is look at that process of racial formation. That will be part of the description and explanation part of what we do as we understand and analyze race and ethnicity. But racial formation was a theory, or is a theory, that was proposed in 1994 by two researchers, Omi and Wenat, and you're going to read a little selection from them. But it's basically the process by which we recognize and define racial groups, right? So social and economic and political forces will determine the content and the importance of racial categories, which in turn will shape the social, economic, and political forces, which are determining the content and importance of racial categories. And you can see as a kind of circular relationship in which the constructs then create real consequences which shape the process of construction, which is going to shape or reshape the content and the importance of racial categories. This will be a recurring theme, but it's a process that looks at how race is defined, how race gets redefined over time. It's a process that looks at the role that political economy plays, right? So what is not just the economic system, but the political decision-making and power that goes into allocating resources and distributing the outcome or the product of those labors. Another thing to keep in mind that we often sort of have a tendency, I think, to overlook is that as we are constructing a category, let's say blackness, we are also definitionally and out of necessity creating a corresponding category, whiteness or non-blackness, right? So as we create categories, it isn't just that we're creating one category over here, we are also simultaneously creating the thing against which it is going to be defined. And that part of it, like studying whiteness, I can say from a sociological perspective, has only really gotten a lot of attention among scholars of race and ethnicity in, say, the last 50 years or so, right? That when people initially started studying race back in the 1800s and 1900s, they were interested in and primarily concerned with looking at racial minorities, what we would call racial minorities. And there was not a lot of attention being paid to what the corresponding construct of whiteness would be, right? And so that's something that we want to keep in mind as well. So the only other thing that I want to talk about before I get out of here is an acknowledgement. Although we aren't going to spend a ton of time on this overtly, it will always be there, kind of as an undercurrent. It'll always be there in the background, and I want you guys to be kind of aware of that as a result. And that is the concept of intersectionality. So some of you, again, this may be a concept that some of you have come across before. For those who haven't, and even for those who have, maybe a nice little refresher. Intersectionality is a theoretical approach to studying inequality, specifically various kinds of structural inequality. Structural inequality is just inequality that is built into how societies operate. So the thing about inequality is that it plays out on a lot of different dimensions, right? So, for example, we have racial inequality in a given society. We have ethnic inequality in a society. We have gender inequality. We have sex inequality. We have inequalities by social class. We have inequalities by age, by level of physical ability, right? So there are a number of different dimensions along which we can find inequalities. And the thing is, when you think about a person, right, that person has a racial identity. That person has an ethnic identity. That person has a gender. That person has a sex. That person has a degree of physical able-bodiedness. That person has an age. That person has a social class position. And they have those things all at the same time. We are never just white or black or brown. We are never just, Irish or Kenyan or Indian. We are never just male or female or intersex. We are never just cisgendered or transgender. Right? We are all those things at the same time all the time. Right? And so if you think about those things as like kind of hierarchies, what we would call a status hierarchy, being in the dominant position in one of those status hierarchies is a consequence of having privilege, or having privilege is a consequence of being in the dominant position, depending on how you want to look at it. So privilege is just, again, the built-in advantages that come from being in that category. Privilege is another one of those things that sometimes gets misunderstood. But privilege, if you want to think about it, I think in a particularly useful way, think about it as the benefits and consequences of being in the dominant category of a social hierarchy. So as a heterosexual person, I was able to marry the person that I loved. And until very recently in this country, that was only something that straight people could do, right? Or to be more precise, gay and lesbians could marry the people they loved, but those relationships would not be recognized as legally valid by the state, by the government. And so there was an inequality there. It was built in. It was the way that it was the law, right? It didn't, as a straight person, I didn't have to go out there and actively work to make sure that gays and lesbians could not marry so that I could enjoy this privilege. I had this privilege because the law was written in a way that benefited people like me at the expense of people not like me in terms of their sexual orientation, their sexuality. So that's privilege, right? Privilege is something that you don't go and work for on your own. In fact, it's really pernicious, because people who have privilege can actually work very, very hard to expand benefits and privileges to other groups of people, thus kind of being good people in our cultural understanding of what that means, and still be the beneficiaries of that privilege, right? So there was a um, there's a woman named Aida Hurtado who wrote a book back in the 90s called The Color of Privilege. And in this book, where she looks at this kind of intersecting set of criteria like race and sex and gender and class and all those other things, she wrote that people with privilege can be infinitely good because they're never required to be personally bad, right? In other words, that regardless of what you do as the recipient of privilege, you're always going to get the privilege, right? You can say you don't want it, it's still going to be there for you. You can work to make sure that other people get access to it, and whether you succeed or fail, the privilege is still going to be there. Right. So there's a lot of sort of misunderstanding that says, people with privilege have to actively give it up. Well, you can't give it up. Um, it's built into the structure of custom and law and the economy and things like that. I mean, if you want to expand the degree to which other people are included in those sets of benefits, you can change laws. But it isn't, you can't get rid of privilege as an individual person. You can't go out and acquire privilege as an individual person. It's built into social structure. It's built into culture. And that's the nature of privilege. So what happens with intersectionality is you can look at people who have privilege maybe in some areas and might be disadvantaged in other areas. Maybe you're white and maybe you're male, but you could also be gay and in a wheelchair, right? So you have, some privilege, right? And you have some disadvantages. You are privileged relative to non-whites, and you are privileged relative to females because you are white and you are male, but you are disadvantaged relative to heterosexuals because you're homosexual, and you're disadvantaged relative to able-bodied people because you're in a mobility device, right? So intersectionality allows us to think about the way in which our social locations reflect all of these simultaneously operating categories and the degree of advantage or disadvantage we have within one or more of them. If you're experiencing disadvantages in more than one category, we would say you're experiencing something we call multiple jeopardy, right? So more than one disadvantaged hierarchy intersecting with others. So you have more than one set of relative disadvantages. And that's the thing. Privilege is always relative to others in that category who aren't privileged, right? So men are privileged relative to women. Um, um, Heterosexuals are privileged relative to homosexuals. Cisgendered people are privileged relative to trans people. Now, a trans person who is rich and who is white is going to possibly experience some disadvantages. They're going to experience, for example, maybe some discrimination, but it is not going to be because they're rich, and it's not going to be because they're white. It's going to be because they're trans. And the problem is that a lot of people don't recognize the complexity of all of those hierarchies and the way that they kind of intersect with each other. So I want you guys to kind of have that concept sort of tucked away in your back pocket as well. And wow, I really went on for a long time about this. I'm sorry. I'm going to try to keep these things a little shorter as the semester unrolls, but there's a lot, obviously, in terms of content and concepts, and I want you guys to have all of it. The beauty of a video is you can stop this and take little breaks and come back to it. So again, if you have any questions, reach out, let me know. And until then, I'll see you next time.